Hey everybody, welcome to the iPhreaks Show. Today on our panel we have Micheal Holt.
How's it going, everybody?
This is Jaim Zuber. I'm calling in from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we have a guest today. Please welcome Jason Zurita.
Hello. Thanks for having me on.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
Jason, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I am an iOS engineer. My background is in electrical engineering, and kind of around the time I was in school, I found the iPhone programming became a thing, and I was very interested in it. So I made a couple games that wound up in the App Store. And then when I graduated, I started work as an electrical engineer, and then always had an interest in coming back to iOS programming and wanted to be tied more into kind of the startup world and the faster paced tech industry. And so I put in the effort to talk computer science language so I can convince someone that I can program for an iPhone, and made the transition, and it's been kind of history ever since.
Very cool. Double E's for life. You know, I found my way into software. I'm not sure even how anymore, but yeah, I got my start doing electrical engineering stuff. But yeah, that's my history.
That's awesome.
So we brought you on the show because you wrote a blog post about using Swift on AWS Lambda. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Yeah.
So the title's I guess pretty self-explanatory in a way. So it's running a website using AWS Lambda, but powered by Swift. So when someone goes to URL, API gateway routes it to a Lambda function that's running Swift, and the Swift executable generates some HTML and sends it back. And it was born out of my love for Swift. I absolutely love the language, and kind of pushing to see where it can go outside of the Apple ecosystem. And I've been doing, so I said I'm an iOS engineer right now, but I've been doing a whole bunch of back-end and front-end work, and I've been exploring those areas. And I guess I was interested in seeing if I can push Swift to be used for a front-end. And I was exploring or using AWS Lambda already, so it was kind of interesting to see if I can make a Lambda function that generated HTML using Swift.
Okay. That's all really cool stuff, but let's take a moment and step back a little bit, because a lot of our listeners are just client developers. We're writing apps, server, totally different team, totally different people. We just consume it. What is AWS and what is Lambda?
Yeah. Okay. So most clients have a backend that they talk to. If they need to persist, say, some client information or do some processing that needs to come back to, say, show a list of store items or something that you want to show in your iOS app. And typically, the backend for that lives it's a computer, aka the cloud, somewhere that is running and responding to your request, your URL request to get the JSON that comes back. And so AWS, or Amazon Web Services, exists to provide the kind of infrastructure for server development. And Lambda is one of their somewhat newer options to run server code. And it falls under the umbrella of serverless. So there's a server that's running, of course, but pretty much what you do is you write some code that, when invoked in the cloud somewhere, will do whatever it is that you wrote it to do and then provide a result. So in my case, the Lambda function gets called by going to a particular website, and the Lambda function runs on the server, Swift on Linux in this case, and it generates the HTML and sends it back.
Okay, how do you write server code without a server if it's serverless?
Yeah, so I kind of touched on it. Serverless is a pretty poor name. There's still a server that's behind the scenes, and really what Lambda is it's an abstraction layer on a server that's running all the time. And so you're only billed for the amount of time that your function is running. And so whenever your code is running, it runs, and then AWS basically picks up and says, okay, well, you ran for a few seconds, so I'm going to bill you for that amount of time. But it is, going back to your question, it is running on a server, but the idea of maintaining the actual server that's running all the time is abstracted away from you. So it's a little bit easier from that sense. And then they also handle things like scaling. So if you have a million requests that come in, like a transient of traffic coming into your website or whatever code that you want to execute in the cloud, then AWS will take care of scaling that for you.
Okay, that makes sense. And just to step way back, in the old days, like if you're doing a startup and you had funding, you spent like $250,000 on your server before you could write any code and serve anything. That's just how it was. With AWS, like, you don't have to do that up front. They host the servers for you. You fire up whichever ones you want. You can run it. That's cool. But you have to manage the server and what's going on. The Lambda, it's a newer paradigm where you don't have to manage the server. You just say, hey, when this request comes in, do this thing.
Right.
So it's a way to not have teams of ops things when your company's not ready for that.
Yeah. It's a great way to get started if you need to have some cloud functionality. And it's kind of interesting, actually, that AWS offers a traditional server where you can manage the scaling, and then they came out with Lambda that competes with themselves in a way. But it seems to be their theme that they're innovating at such a rapid pace that they're just trying to beat themselves.
Cool. So tell us about using Swift with Lambda. We all love writing Swift in our client apps or our iPhone apps. How do we write backend code on Lambda?
Yeah. So the way that I do it is I use a Docker container, and if you're not familiar with Docker, just pretend like it fakes being a Linux environment, and you could have a Mac OS cloud computer running, but that's just not what AWS offers. And
okay, so there's no cloud.
Yeah,
and there are actually servers on serverless, and we're faking a container. Okay,
right.
Am I getting this right?
Yeah. And so the whole idea of this Docker container is so that you can fake running your code in an environment where it will be deployed. So when you actually deploy your Swift executable to Lambda, you're basically faking the environment locally on your Mac. And that's what Docker lets you do. So we can dive into that a little bit more if you want to. But the idea is that Amazon has this thing that's called an Amazon, I think it's like Amazon Linux. And it's their version of Linux that runs in Lambda. And so you could run your Swift code in a Linux environment And now you are kind of divorcing yourself from the iOS ecosystem in a way, where UIKit doesn't exist. Foundation exists, but it's a different version of Foundation. And so, but the community has done an amazing job at getting Foundation's parity on Linux to be similar to that on, say, an iOS app.
Okay, so one of the benefits of Docker is that you can get it to run on your own machine without having to do all your editing on the AWS website or however that works. How do you set up Docker?
So you go to Docker's website and you install it. It's pretty simple.
Okay.
And that's one of the beauties of Docker is that once you have it installed, and then if you go to the blog post that I have somewhere towards the bottom, there is a make file that I wrote, and what it does is there's a command that says Docker run my Swift code, and it will spin up a Docker container using the Linux environment that you want, like the Amazon one that I'd mentioned, and run my code. And so there's actually, I should say, there's two flavors of what I wrote in this blog post. So there's local development, and then there's the Docker stuff that we were just talking about. There is a way for Swift will just run on your Mac because it can, and I have a setup where I will generate an index.html file from the Swift code that you're developing. So you can do local development to see what your website looks like. And then when you're ready to package it all up, you have to package it with Docker because you need it to be built against the Linux environment. If that makes sense.
Okay. Very cool. So with this, you're just creating a website generator, like a Jekyll type thing.
Yeah, in a way.
Okay.
The blog that I have runs on Jekyll, and it's pretty similar.
Okay. Have you looked at other options? So just as a developer, and having looked into server-side Swift options, this is a brand new one, so I kind of like this idea, this approach. But have you compared it to things like Vapor or Kitura or Perfect, which are other server-side Swift options? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So a little bit. I've played with Vapor and Kitura a bit. Those Swift server-side solutions are more robust and built out. So they have the solution to build a front end and a website built into them, but they're also managing the scaling of the server that you have running, and you could also do a lot more robust processing of the incoming route that's coming in. So if you need to return JSON for a customer that's in your database, then you can, those solutions are more built out for that kind of back end. And so the blog post that I wrote is really centered around the beginning exploration about how to use AWS Lambda and serverless, and to start exploring how Swift can run in a much more lightweight kind of deployment solution and do some simple functions. So let's say you didn't want a website, you could have it hit a URL if you want, process the JSON, and then send it back to your client. And it could also, maybe one thing that I've been looking at exploring a little bit more is interacting with, like, how do you have a database with AWS Lambda? And that ties into, you could use DynamoDB, which is another AWS offering, but Kitura and Perfect and all those, and Vapor, they're going to provide all of those things right out of the box.
Yeah, and those also seem to be solutions that are more based on they're not serverless basically, whereas your solution here is more serverless.
Right.
Okay, that's cool. What about templating? So why do you not recommend templating with your solution with AWS?
So with templating, you lose a lot of the Swift type safety. And so I'm using in the blog post a DSL or domain specific language that was created by the folks at Point Free. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, but it's a video tutorial site teaching functional programming in Swift. And the really great thing is that they dog food everything that they're talking about. So their entire website is backed by Swift. It's Swift on the server. It's a Swift generated front end. So the website's in Swift also. And they wrote this domain specific language to generate HTML from using Swift. And so you get all of the enforcement of type safety in Swift. And then it also codifies a lot of things that would be a little bit looser. So taking a step higher, I guess, is that you can encode the HTML spec. So you couldn't do invalid things that HTML wouldn't let you do. And going back to templating is that you're really writing a skeleton of what your site would look like, and then you're filling at all of the dynamicism for that template. And so it's not, there are bugs that can get introduced because of that, because it's not type checked. Very cool.
Yeah, I agree completely.
So tell us about some of the libraries you're using for this. There's a lot of stuff going on here. What libraries are you using?
Yeah, so there's quite a bit to unpack here. So I mentioned the DSL written by the folks at Point Free, and so it uses two of their libraries. There's HTML or Swift HTML, so that gives you the domain specific language for writing HTML, and then to style the HTML, they have a Swift CSS, and so that's another package that lets you connect all of the stylings to HTML. And then there's AWS Lambda, and that's an offering that's not so much a package that you need to manage, but that's the deployment environment. But there's an extra little wrinkle in that AWS Lambda lets when it natively supports Python and JavaScript, and it doesn't natively support Swift. And so AWS came out with this thing called AWS Layers that lets you write a layer which can be a language runtime. And you can have, in this case, the Swift runtime as an AWS layer that your Lambda function, and now this is maybe starting to get a little bit complicated, but the Lambda function sits on top, your Swift executable on the layer, and the layer is the runtime for your Lambda function to run, which is in Swift in this case. And we can step back to that, but I'll keep stepping through the different things that I use here. Then to do the routing to your Lambda function, because your Lambda functions are really just a cloud function waiting to get called, and it can get called a number of different ways. And one of those ways is through a URL request, but that URL request needs to get routed to the Lambda function, and the way that happens is through API Gateway. And so that's another AWS offering. And moving on, if you're going to be doing any sort of Swift on Linux, you're going to want to start using the Swift package manager. And my project certainly does, and it pulls in the dependencies like the DSLs that I spoke about, and uses Swift package manager for that. And then I use a make file just to make the executing and building the Swift executable, make that a little bit easier.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the layers. So you give it Swift code and it converts it to something else. Is that Java, Python? Is that something below both of them? What's happening there?
Yeah, so the AWS layer, it's really cool. It can do a whole bunch of things. And like I said, the one thing is creating a runtime for Swift to run in. And there's a project that I found that I forget the individual's name, but it talks, I guess to put it in its most basic form, is it talks AWS Lambda talk. And it allows, it builds the Swift runtime so that you can build your functions, your Swift functions on top of that. And so it's totally native. There were some versions of AWS Lambda functions running Swift, but using a JavaScript kind of facade in a way. So the JavaScript can run natively in AWS, like I mentioned before, and the JavaScript would start a process which was your Swift code, and it was really neat, but it wasn't really that performant because it was JavaScript that you're going through an intermediate layer. This Lambda AWS layer is a totally real Swift runtime for the Lambda functions.
So who's in charge of maintaining this runtime?
So when you build it one time, and then you upload it to AWS as a layer, and then you can now use it for any Lambda function that you want that you're running Swift in. And so you just basically, when you're building your Lambda function, you tell it, I want it to use this custom runtime, and this is the layer that I want to give it. And so you're basically the one who's maintaining it. And I got bit by the ABI stability bug a little bit, and now that we're ABI stable for Swift, this won't be an issue. But before ABI stability, the interesting thing that I came across is that when I built the Swift runtime, I did it with a non-ABI stable version of Swift. And then I have a part 2 to the blog post. And so when I went to go update the website for part 2, I compiled the Swift executable that generates the HTML and CSS with a new version of Swift. I uploaded it, and the Lambda function just totally blew up. And it was a really satisfying moment to actually know how ABI stability comes into play. And so now the runtime, if you're building it with Swift 5 and later, you should hopefully have a much more minimal amount of maintenance that you need to do with the runtime.
Okay, very cool. So would you recommend using this type of setup for a personal blog? Or what type of systems would this work for?
Yeah. So I guess there's two parts to the answer. The first thing is I think that Swift Lambda functions are something really great to explore in themselves. Something I'm doing currently at work requires a Lambda function to call in and make an external call, and it just needs to do its one little job really well all the time, and that's a great candidate for having a Swift AWS Lambda function. And it's really great because if your background is in iOS development, then you're writing the same language that you are in for your client code. The other thing is, as far as this being something that is practical for websites, I definitely want to keep exploring this. And one thing I think that might be really interesting to see is how Swift UI ties into getting outside of the Apple ecosystem. There's already a couple projects. What's that?
I was just going to ask that.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I'm really interested to see. There's a couple projects that popped up that is using Swift UI to generate HTML, and it would be very interesting to see if we can start using it in areas like what I did. And so there's more exploration that I'd like to do around having a website run purely and see what kind of scaling that you get and the response time from the website. But generally, everything seems to be pretty great and promising, especially as Swift continues to be maturing as a language and continuing to break out of the Apple ecosystem. And one other thing to add to that is AWS Lambda is extremely cost effective. So when I first launched this blog post, I got picked up by iOS Dev Weekly, which was pretty cool. And I got a bunch of incoming traffic, and my pricing went up for AWS by 5,000%, and with a grand total of $0. So it's pretty interesting how cost effective it could be to run server code using AWS.
That's very cool. So I'm curious about how SwiftUI outside of the Apple ecosystem, not ecosystem, but like Apple devices, like views, like iPhones, Macs. How would that even work in the web world?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There would need to be some sort of translation layer that converts your SwiftUI code to HTML. And a couple of folks have seemed to have been playing with that. And not entirely, this is kind of where things get a little bit fuzzy for me, but I'm interested to see how that's possible. I would imagine that there is some sort of translation layer between SwiftUI and if it's being run on AppKit or UIKit, but I wonder where that middle layer is and how accessible it is for us to port SwiftUI to other things.
Okay, are there any projects we can check out? Blog posts?
Yeah. So let's see. Vox, I think is the name. There's an HTML DSL for Swift. Let me see. Yeah, I think this one talks about it. Maybe this is tied into using the function builders more than Swift UI. But then there was another, I think it was, the blog is worth doing it badly, rendering Swift UI views to HTML. And
okay, I found that one.
Yeah.
I'll drop in the show notes for our listeners if you want to check that out.
Yeah, I also have it in the part 2 blog post along with Vox, but I'm very interested to see if Apple comes out and says, Swift UI could be, this is how you link to it to use it on other platforms.
Okay.
Who knows if that'll happen, but it's I wouldn't be totally surprised.
Okay. Like what else is out there people trying to do with Swift UI? I wasn't considering people doing HTML with it. Anything else like crazy stuff they're doing?
I haven't seen anything aside from seeing some really great examples on Twitter for different animations, and I'm playing with it a little bit. It seems to be extremely great with just in general, but I haven't seen anything breaking out of the Apple ecosystem exactly.
I wonder if a prerequisite to that would be kind of like how they have Foundation they had to rewrite it kind of for Linux. I imagine something similar would have to happen with Swift UI as well.
Yeah, and it would be very interesting to see if Apple comes out with a server side framework themselves. Maybe they use Swift UI as the front end language for that. That would be really cool.
That would be sweet. So what else can we talk about the blog post and what you're doing?
Yeah, I think we touched on pretty much everything. I definitely wanted to make note of the pricing. and it's really it's interesting to see how Swift is kind of blooming on its own. Even outside of Linux, scripting in Swift is really great. But I think we covered everything pretty much for the blog post.
Cool.
Yeah, I got one last question. Were you able to use Xcode for most of this stuff?
So I use Vim for everything outside of Apple platform development. I probably could have used Xcode, but I like Vim.
So how does how does autocomplete work with Vim?
Yeah, so it's not entirely great yet, although with the language server protocol support that Swift has now, it's getting better. So the autocomplete is a plugin that you can pull in with the language server protocol, and I don't know if it's out of beta yet, but that's going to make it a whole lot better. And then I believe that Xcode is eventually, if not already, going to use the same language server protocol. So Vim and any other IDE will have the same access to the autocomplete that Xcode already has.
Very cool. I asked because I tried doing like iPhone development on Emacs a number of years ago. And this was before Swift, so it was Objective-C, and I tried getting the autocomplete working, and it was just so slow.
Yeah.
At that point, it was just unusable. So I couldn't get it to work, and I was disappointed. But I'm glad to see Vim is having more luck, and probably Emacs too, if someone wants to play with it. All right, Emacs people, that's your challenge. I'm not doing it.
Yeah, I definitely tried to use Vim for iOS development, and it's Xcode has such a tight integration with that Apple ecosystem that it's hard to not use it. But I did install my the Vim key bindings. I got that working in Xcode, so I'm partially happy.
Awesome. Well, let's get to the picks. Michael, what do you have for us?
All right. Well, this week I found an article on Medium posted by, let's see if I can pronounce his name here, Besher al-Maleh. But it's a very in-depth and very good description of how and when to use weak self versus unowned self versus just leaving it as a strong. And the main focus of the article is that you don't always need weak self, because I have to admit sometimes I've just put in weak self in all of my closures just to be safe, which there's not too much wrong with that, but his article is mainly about how you don't necessarily need to. And it was a really good read and helped me learn about the differences of when those should be really used, when they need to be used, and how they should be used. And then he also has a section about escaping versus non-escaping closures, which was very informative as well. So I'll make sure a link to that is put in the description here.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, I know I've gotten in the habit of just doing it reflexively, even in cases where I don't need to. This doesn't have to be weak, because there's the cases where it doesn't have to be weak, and there's cases where it does have to be weak, and there's the in between cases where you're like, oh wait, this goes on a memory, is it there, and kind of you run around in circles and you forget which case is which sometimes. So
yeah, it's almost like you want to be safe than sorry, and you just default to weak.
Right.
Yes, that is the safe way to do it.
Even if you don't need weak here, the person reviewing the code or encountering it in a year or two is wait a minute, does it have to be weak? And they don't have to. And then they're thinking about through the weird art cases that may or may not happen. But no, cool. I look forward to checking out that blog post. So I've got one pick. I got news today that someone I had known, a musician, had passed away. Jeff Austin, who played in the Yonder Mountain String Band, which is a bluegrass band, and they started in the late 90s. One of the later bluegrass bands was for a long time. There were very few bluegrass musicians out there, but they kind of started a resurgence in the early 2000s. And people I knew him, so I got to meet him a couple times, but he passed away. I heard the news today, so I'm just going to share a couple albums I liked of his, and the Iron Mountain String Band, if you like bluegrass. It's good stuff. So one of the albums is Elevation, which is one of their first albums. It's an album I listened to a long time ago, and I enjoyed quite a bit. Got Daryl Anger on fiddle, if that's a thing to you. If you know bluegrass, you probably know Daryl Angle. So that's one good album, and he did a solo album, I guess a duo album with Chris Castino at the Big Woo, who's a Minneapolis musician, and that's a good album. Came out in 2004. Songs from the Tin Shed. So, yeah, still processing that he is no longer with us, but those are some good albums that I've enjoyed, and you might too if you like bluegrass or just acoustic music. So check it out. Jason, do you have a pick for us?
Yeah. It's funny, we already started talking about Vim because I had it slated down to as one of my picks. But really just Vim and Emacs in general. There's a lot of holy war between the two, and somebody told me just pick one, learn it, use it to take notes, and you'll see that there's so much power in it. And that person was totally right. I ended up choosing Vim because that's what he was familiar in, and it's easier to have somebody to help you. And I got Vim key bindings installed in Xcode, and I learned all sorts of interesting things about just how computers work and code works, where originally when I started iOS development, I always thought the project file was this like magic super special file, and it's really all code is just text, and editors are just a nice layer on top of that to make it look pretty. And I highly recommend checking one of those out. And then you also have the side benefit of being more productive in coding since you don't have to use a mouse as much. And I also wrote a blog post if anybody wants to check it out about getting started and how to get the key bindings working in Xcode.
Very cool. No, I if I can go back, I would probably choose Vim over Emacs. Funny enough, like the first time I had ever programmed was with Vim, with VI way back in the day for a college class. And we had a terminal that just was laggy and buggy. So you press escape and you didn't know what was going to happen. So I spent most of my time just furious at the thing not doing it right. Hit escape. Is it in edit mode? I don't know. So when I started doing Linux development, one of the leads just asked me, so you're going to want to pick an editor, either Vim or Emacs, something like that. And I'm like, well, definitely not Vim. So I'll try this Emacs thing. But now I have the key bindings in my fingers. They're just stuck there. That's just how it is. But no, Vim's good stuff. I think if I could go do it again, I think the philosophy is a little bit more my style. Every time I want to actually write code in Emacs, I end up just messing with Emacs for 3 hours.
Yeah, that same thing with Vim. There'll be some days where I get nerd sniped pretty bad, and I try to find out how to get indenting to work in a special way, and
right.
That's several hours down the drain.
It's like, I'm writing Python today, and this doesn't line up right. Let me figure out how to fix that. And
yep.
I didn't get anything done. So now so for code, I don't use any of those, but my Git, that's definitely Emacs. Let me tell you. Cool. So, Jason, if people want to get a hold of you, how can they find you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, Jason Alex Zurita. I had to put the middle name in there because somebody has Jason Zurita. And if you go to jasonzurita.com, that's the blog. That's my site where I blog. I try to write about once a month. I have been slacking on that a little bit as of late, but and I'll also be talking at SwiftFest that's coming up at the end of July. So if anybody's going and wants to chat, look me up.
All right. Where is SwiftFest?
Oh, I should have mentioned that. It's in Boston.
Boston. Okay. Very cool. Well, thanks for coming on the show, Jason. I learned a bunch about how to get stuff working on AWS Lambda. So that's cool stuff.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. I listen to the podcast all the time, so this is great.
Oh, very cool. For everyone else, we'll see you next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly